So as we begin this evening, I wanted to go ahead and share my screen here. One second. I hope everyone is able to see now. All right. Give me a thumbs up if you're able to see the screen. That way I know that everyone is a bit awake. Awesome. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So as we begin this study series, I've labeled Transforming the Heart, and it's a four-part series, as you probably have already seen in the flyer that was published. And there's going to be four particular topics that I'll be going over here. The first being the battle against pride. Second, next week will be facing ourselves and the mirror within. Third, redirecting our inner monologue. And then four, letting go and union with God. So I hope for those of you who are here, we'll be able to join in the coming weeks and we'll be able to kind of study and learn together. And again, as I mentioned before, if for any reason you missed the session, you can always refer back to the recordings, which will be posted on our diocesan website. Transforming the heart, that is a very, very complex terminology there. First of all, we have two main words here, the heart, and then we have transforming. I know a lot of times when we think of the word transforming, we think of movies like The Transformers, or we think of, the things that we see in the world today, whether it be movies or whether it be images or whether it be videos, these things, where we see the basic concept of change. When we talk about something transforming, it goes from one state to another. There's a change that occurs, there's a change that happens. And so the reason why I've intentionally used the word transforming the heart is that is what we are seeking, right? We're seeking a change in our heart. A lot of times people feel that I can't really control my heart. I can't really control my thoughts. I can't really control my actions. I am who I am. And we often label it that way and we leave it that way to the point where we become unchanged. But the reality is the heart is something that constantly needs to be formed and constantly needs development so that it can be changed. And what is it that we're changing for? And what is it that we're transforming to? We're not trying to be someone that we are not. We are trying to change our heart for a greater purpose. And that purpose is what I hope to lead us to be able to understand by the end of the session. So the first session, as I mentioned, the battle against pride. Ooh, sounds very difficult. And when we look at the word pride, I don't know I haven't looked into the details of the actual root of the word, but I always find it interesting that at the word and at the center of that word, five-letter word, as you can see in the yellow highlight, is what letter? The letter I. We all often associate pride to myself, right? To I, me, myself, and I. That's usually the way we understand it. And as we look deeper into that word, pride it's what we often consider to be a sense of abnormal self-love, abnormal self-love. And what I mean by that is we all know that there's a sense of love that we have for others, love for families, love for friends, right? And so when you truly love others and when you go out of your way to help others or to truly love others in the sense of unconditional love, what often happens? You often forget about yourself, right? I know there are many people in the world that I meet today that they will truly die for others. They truly will live for others, right? In a sense, they've forgot about themselves. It almost seems that way. But if we begin with the example of Christ himself, if there's anyone that could have displayed pride, in my opinion, it could have been Christ himself, right? You have someone who is the God of the universe. We have a king. We have someone who is filled with royalty, someone who has the power and the grace, the wisdom, the knowledge that is beyond this world. But we noticed that everything of who Christ is, it's not about himself. It's about the giving of himself for the sake of others. And so when we look at that, when we talk about pride, we begin to lose sight of others and we begin to gain this abnormal type of self-love. And what does that look like? And we'll be going into detail, but I just wanted to give this as a highlight and as an overview. If you were to really truly define pride, if I was to ask a Sunday school child, or if I was to ask an adult, what is pride? Most people would say, well, it's when you consider yourself more than others. That's true, but it's deeply rooted with this concept of love. True pride is when you have this self-love that kind of slowly creeps up and slowly builds up to the point where now you've gone to an abnormal state. The second thing to know about pride is it's a depersonalization of one's true self. See, oftentimes, if you've ever seen in movies or when we've talked about life in general, when we look at ourselves, when we step out of the comfort of our home, we tend to be someone else, right? And when we come back to our home, we feel like we can be ourselves, right? It doesn't matter what we look like. It doesn't matter how we're dressed. It doesn't matter what it is that we're doing because no one knows, no one sees, right? But when we go out into the real world, it's very different, right? And so pride in that sense becomes a depersonalization of one's true self. So what that means is you're being someone that you truly are not at a moment in time when others are looking or when others are seeking or when you're having the attention of others. But when you don't have that, you tend to be someone else, right? So now it's almost kind of like living a double life. And we are all guilty of this, whether it be, males or females, children or adults, priests, bishops. I think we all have fallen into this trap, right? We lose sight of our identity and of our true self. And oftentimes we don't even realize it because it has become so habitual and so part of our everyday life that we have now depersonalized who we are. And the third thing is we're now centered on oneself. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we forget about others and our life is centered on ourself. So there's three aspects here. One, the concept of love, which is to be shared with others, is now only being contained within ourselves. The second thing is the depersonalization of one's true self. What that means is, although we are to stay true to ourselves no matter where we are or what moment or what time, what happens is we kind of compartmentalize our life to the point where now we're depersonalizing ourselves into these sections. And then third, we now are centered on ourselves. And once we become centered on ourselves, that's what leads to the I, which is the me, myself, and I in pride. So I just wanted to give this basic understanding of what's pride. You can go into details. There's so much more theological concepts, but at a very basic level and a basic understanding of what it means to be prideful, it's an abnormal self-love, depersonalization of one's true self, and this idea or concept of being centered on oneself. As we move into the dimensions of pride, sometimes people think that pride is just something that, people just contain in their body, right? It's just contained in their mind, or it's just who they are and they can't change themselves. And I would say this is a myth that often people, believe, but the reality is each and every part of pride can always be changed. And that has to be because you have to understand where that pride is stemming from. What is the root of that pride? So there's kind of three aspects that we talk about in Christian life: the mind, the body, and the soul. You can always equate the soul to the heart. In Orthodox theology and in our life, we always talk about the heart, which is the transformation of the heart. But if we just start looking at these basic dimensions of pride: mind, body, and soul. Let's start with those three. Let's think about the mind. Where does pride stem in terms of the psychological aspect of ourselves and the mind? If you think about our life and where we are, oftentimes this is where a lot of it kind of stems and it begins. There's those thoughts that come up, right? The thoughts that, hey, I'm better than that other person, or hey, this is who I am, or I achieved this, right? So these thoughts start coming into your mind, right? And as these thoughts start coming into your mind, again, where is it coming from? And we're going to be going into that into the next slide. But there's this perception and there's this constant thought process that goes into our mind where we are feeding this pride into our mind, right? The second aspect is our body, the physical. And this is very difficult as human beings because we don't want to appear to someone else and in a what would I say, not so much, we don't want to present ourselves in a lowly way to others, right? I notice oftentimes when we go for weddings, when we go for major functions, when we go for job interviews, we always present with our best, right? Even for church on Sundays, we always go with our best, right? We take the showers, we're finding the most expensive clothing, we have jewelry, makeup, whatnot, all those kind of things, because the presentation of our body and the presentation of what is perceived by others, it also associates to certain things. So, for example, when you see a homeless person on the street, do we ever think that a homeless person is prideful, right? But when we see someone like the president, or we see someone like a priest or a bishop, do we associate pride to that individual, right? So there's a physical dimension of the body that we perceive and that we look at, whether it's looking at others or others looking into us. There's this dimension of pride that comes and stems from just simple appearance of things and the way we look at things. And then the third aspect is the inner soul, the spiritual aspect. So this is a lot more harder to detect, right? And we're going to be going into this in the next couple of slides. But when you think about the spiritual aspect and the soul, very few of us really even are able to see or recognize or even acknowledge the pride that is within the soul. And the reason for that is manyfold, but at a very simple, basic level, let me give some examples. What does it mean to be prideful in the soul, right? So something as simple as like, I don't really need to go to church today, right? And that thought pops into the mind. And you can argue, yes, and you can say that we all have things to do, we have things to catch up. True. But at the same time, what happens is it begins to feed our soul in such a way that what is happening there? What is the core of that issue? We are now centering on ourselves and our needs rather than the obligation to have to either worship God or present ourselves before God, or even what I would say is meet God and encounter God. We begin to isolate, right? And I'm not saying that those who miss church once in a lifetime or once in blue moon, that you have sinned and you have done and you exemplify pride. That is not the point to say. But what I mean is that pride kind of creeps up, right? So you begin with that first step of saying, hey, I'm not going to really go to church today because I got something else to do, right? And then what happens is the next week or the next time, you now justify that, right? You justify that act by saying, you know what? Well, I did it last time, so it should be okay this time, right? And now it becomes once and then twice, and now it soon forms as a habit, right? In another dimension of pride at the soul, there's often times where, just like the publican and the Pharisee, right? We begin to justify ourselves into saying, like, you know what? I fast. Hey, I receive Qurbana. Hey, I confess, right? I do all of these things. And we begin to justify ourselves before others in a way where now we look at the soul and we look at ourselves and we're like, hey, we're doing pretty good, right? We're doing pretty good. So this is the spiritual pride that begins to develop. And so the mind, the body, and the soul are all dimensions that we have to look at. It's not something where you're just going to be able to control your thoughts that moment. It's not that you're just going to be able to look at something, whether it be your body or others, and just all of a sudden just say, hey, snap out pride. It doesn't work like that. And also the soul, being able to dive deeper and to actually look and reflect in the soul, there are some key steps that we got to take, which we'll be talking about in just a few moments. And then the last thing is there's a communal aspect to pride. And what I mean by that is others. If you've ever noticed in pride, and I'm just going to be open about this and being able to explain, how much easier is it to find pride in others than yourself, right? Think about the many times in your life where you have said, hey, that person is prideful, right? Or that person is too proud of themselves and blah, blah, blah. And we keep going on. And we start looking at others. So we know what pride looks like. But the problem is it's easier to identify and see in others rather than ourselves, right? And part of that reason is, again, because we are self-loving and we are self-justifying, and then we are depersonalizing ourselves, right? And kind of going back to that previous slide, we are now centering on ourselves to where we now think ourselves as greater than others. So there's a communal aspect to this that we cultivate and that we create within society and within our churches, is because we are easily able to identify pride in others, but we're not able to look at ourselves. And we all, including myself, are guilty of this. As a priest, it's something that we always have to preach about, right? We preach to our congregation, we preach to our people, to our flock, and we preach humility, but to live it is a much more difficult task, right? And I think in order to truly be able to understand pride and to be able to tackle it and to truly battle it, is you got to recognize the signs and symptoms. And that's kind of where we're going to be going to in terms of the struggle of pride a little bit more. One of the biggest things that the church fathers speak about is the difficulty to detect pride. As I mentioned before, it is really the most difficult of many sins to really identify in ourselves. Why? Because many of the church fathers have described it as one of the most deadliest sins. Why? Because it's an unseen enemy. It's an unseen enemy. Unseen in the sense to us, but maybe seen by others. If you think about other types of sins that we commit, whether it be lying, or whether it be cheating, or whether it be lust, or whether it be greed, a lot of these types of sins and these struggles and these passions, they tend to become more visible over time, right? Pride, on the other sense, again, it doesn't become so visible to us as much as it is to others. And very few times are we going to allow other people to come to us and say, hey, did you realize that you're just being very prideful? We don't have those type of conversations. Why? Because it's awkward. Because what is the other person going to perceive? That we now consider ourselves better than them, and vice versa. There's this battle between people that we face. And so it's one of the fewest things that are talked about in conversations. We never talk about pride amongst ourselves, but we talk about it internally. We process it internally, and we look at others internally. But at the same time, it's not something that we talk about openly because it's the unseen enemy. And this is one of the greatest ways that Satan works to bring about sin into this world. If you look at Adam and Eve, right? Or if you look at Moses, if you look at the Israelites, if you look at Pharaoh, if you look at the Pharisees, if you look at the Sadducees, as you go throughout the scriptures, there's an element of pride in almost every single biblical story or encounter. But in that element of pride, what happens? There's this humility that is eventually taught, learned, experienced to the point where they give themselves to others. They let go of themselves. And that's the process that we're trying to get to. So very difficult to detect. At the same time, watching others and criticizing others. Again, as I mentioned in the previous slide, we have this tendency where we're constantly looking at other people. We're constantly criticizing them for every action and every small thing that they do wrong. And we're kind of standing on the bleachers or standing or sitting in the bleachers, looking at this battle that is happening before us, but not realizing that we too are also part of this battle and that we too are also part of this struggle. So I want to lead to some of the signs and examples of pride. And again, this is not a comprehensive list, but just some things that came to my mind this evening that I wanted to share. So how do we even begin to recognize if we are being prideful? Or how do we even begin to know if there is pride in our life? So the first example is justifying ourselves before God and others. What does that mean? We look at the Pharisee and the publican, simple parable that Jesus spoke about, right? You have the Pharisee who is a ruler, right? He's a leader. He knows the law. In fact, oftentimes they used to carry these tablets with the law written on them because they were the experts, right? They knew that they had to fast. They knew they had to pray. They knew they had to fulfill these obligations. They knew that you could not work on the Sabbath, then all of that was done. But then you have this lowly publican, right? And this lowly publican is living his simple life in humility. And here the Pharisee comes and prays before God, Lord, you know that I have fasted just as great as others, right? And he begins to pray. And then the publican, he starts to cry out and says, Lord, have mercy upon me, a sinner. There was nothing that the publican could pray and say that I did or that he felt like could justify himself before God. So he recognized the sake of who he is in the sense that he is nothing in the sight of God, but he is everything through God, right? And that's where it begins. Whereas the Pharisee, he begins to self exemplify himself, right? He begins to proclaim himself before God, right? And he begins to compare himself to this publican and says, Lord, you know I'm better than him. You know, he's done much worse, right? But I've kept your law, I've kept your commandments, I've fasted and done all these things. If we ever get to that point, we are bringing pride into our life. We can never justify ourselves before God and others. But at the same time, you don't want to falsely bring humility into your life when you're saying, Lord, I'm a sinner and I can never do good and I'm just horrible and I'm just bad. That's also not okay. You don't want to go to both extremes. We need to find a balance. When we do wrong, we are able to admit that and we're able to bring that before God and say, Lord, I am striving to do better. I am striving to learn humility. Teach me how to be humble and forgive me for justifying myself before others or before you, right? So it's a path to repentance. The second thing is seeking glory, honor, and praise. We all know people who love to be the center of attention, right? And that can be a good thing, right? There are some people who are very, very talented in bringing attention to themselves, but ultimately leading it in a positive way to encourage and uplift others, right? There are some people that God has truly gifted to be able to become leaders or to become great speakers or to become people who can lead others to the path into the kingdom of God, right? But then at the same time, those positions or those gifts that are being given can also be opportunities that lead to pride. You know, if you're a great singer, right? If you're a great speaker, if you're someone who has achieved a lot or, you know, a millionaire and, you know, you're on top of the world and, you know, the prestige in terms of our vehicles and our homes, right? And we're constantly seeking that praise. We're constantly seeking those positions of honor and we're constantly seeking that glory. If you find no fulfillment in just being able to live your life without that, you're in a dangerous territory of being prideful. And if that is what you're living for, and if that is what you're seeking, and sometimes you don't get it and you're just not satisfied until someone praises you, until someone honors you, or until someone glorifies you in that way, you are in a dangerous territory. Okay. The third thing is constantly displeased or complaining. What do I mean by that? If we look at the Israelites as they were journeying through the wilderness, right? 40 years going through the wilderness, they began to complain. They began to be displeased. They began to say, Lord, how long are you going to keep us hungry? How long are you going to keep us thirsty? What is it that we are even journeying for, right? And in the same way, if you look at our daily life, there are some people who are constantly complaining, right? There's never anything positive that maybe comes from their mouth because they're just dissatisfied. And you could go out of your way to do something amazing for them. You can go out and maybe make something for them. You can go out and maybe take them to do something, but they will still find some form of complaint, whether that be food, whether that be a gift that you give, or whether that just be anything in life in terms of their job or their family situation or just where they belong. They're never satisfied with what they have and always are looking at what they're without and constantly displeased and complaining. And what I mean by that is this is another example of pride, right? If we are constantly displeased or constantly complaining, we are displaying an element of pride, much like the Israelites in the wilderness. A fourth example is interfering in the affairs of others, a desire to direct others. I know when we think about this in a workplace environment, for example, as employers, you think about many of you might be in supervisory positions. You might be in positions of leadership. You might be positions in which you've had years of experience and you're the most knowledgeable one out of the rest of the team, right? I'm sure all of us can relate in some way, shape, or form. Or let's say, for example, even education aspect, whether you're in college or school or even professional degrees or whatnot, where you have obtained a higher level of, education and knowledge and things like that. Or even if something as simple as being able to know how to cook, right? And someone else not knowing how to cook, right? So in all of these examples, when we have this knowledge, right? And when we feel like we're, quote, the know-it-alls, what happens is we begin to interfere into the affairs of others and we desire to direct them. We want to be able to tell them, hey, this is how you do it. No, even if you do it that way, this is how it needs to be done. And I'm not saying this is all situations and all circumstances. There are times where people do need to be directed. There are times where people do need a sense of direction, a sense of guidance, but those are usually more rare occasions. If you find yourself doing that often, or even every day, or every moment, where no one can kind of guide you or allow you to, or you cannot think of something of achieving a goal through another path other than the way you see it, that can now also be a dangerous territory of pride, because there could be many paths to the same outcome, but we cannot convince ourselves that the path that we have or the path that we are on or what we know is the only way and expect others to follow that and desire to direct them in that way. Number 5, very obvious one, but boasting of oneself, exalting oneself. And what I mean by boasting, it's really that self-proclamation, right? I have done this, or I have achieved this, right? And the list goes on. You've seen people who have displayed this, right? And it's about, again, the I, the me, the me. And here I am, here's what I've done, here's what I know, here's what I do. And you're not even allowing others to be able to see it and recognize it and speak it about yourself, but you're proclaiming yourself and boasting in yourself. And again, all of us maybe have been guilty. And a lot of times children learn this at a very young age, right? If you think about it, especially in households where there's siblings, where there's 2 or 3 siblings, oftentimes we do this, especially as Indian or Malayali communities, where we begin to compare children to one another. And we begin to say, hey, you need to be like this person because, hey, look, they got the good grades and they got this. And we're all guilty of that. And part of it is to encourage, part of it is to push, part of it is to really give someone like that encouragement to say, hey, you need to do better. But the problem is if you begin to, do it in such a way where it kind of misguides people, it's a dangerous territory, right? The 6th example is looking down on others. And this is what I consider to be fault finding. No matter how good others do or how much they try or attempt something, individuals will find some sense of fault in another person or in what others do. And that could be anything. It could be in the way they look. It could be in the way they speak. It could be the way they think, constantly pointing out the faults and the weaknesses of others. Again, it's about those fingers and pointing that finger not to others, but to yourself. Number 7, the disobedience to authorities and unwilling to submit. This is a very difficult aspect of it. In this sense of disobedience to authorities, it's really that situation where you begin to look at, and this could be anything, as I mentioned before, parents and children. It could be, an employer and employee relationship. It could be a priest and a parishioner type of relationship. There's a sense of disobedience to authorities. Whenever someone is considered to even be just even an ounce above you in a position of authority, there's this unwillingness to submit. And this is really deeply rooted in pride. Okay. The eighth one is attribute any success to their own effort and doing. We all have been blessed in many ways with so many talents, so many achievements, so many abilities to be able to grow in our day-to-day life and our work, and with all the blessings that we have achieved, or that we have received, not achieved, received. But oftentimes those receiving of blessings is often attributed to our own efforts and doing. We see St. Paul speaking in the scriptures and making it very clear. He never boasted in himself, right? He always, in every passage that you read, in every letter that St. Paul wrote, there was always the attribution of any success, of anything good in himself, he attributed to God, right? And he attributed to the spirit that is within him, that dwells within him, that builds him. So this is something that we can begin to see. Number 9, ignoring or neglecting others. This is kind of like the parable of the Good Samaritan, where you have the priest, you have, the Levite and all these people who are passing by as pretty much witnesses, but at the same time bystanders, and they're just passing by. They're ignoring, they're neglecting, because they're not willing to come down to the level of someone who's in need. They're not willing to be able to come down to the level of someone who is hurting, someone who is in pain, someone who is in misery. And then the last one, and I think this is a very important one that I would just want to highlight, is you might have gotten into those arguments where you desire to have the last word always, right? Someone responds back and you're going back and forth, you're being defensive, and you're wanting to have that last word. You just cannot let someone else win. You cannot let someone else be right. And what I would say, it's not about being right or wrong. And it's not about desiring to have the last word. There's nothing to defend. It's simply about bringing ourselves to the level of other people so that both parties involved can take a moment to submit themselves to the other and say, hey, look, I certainly have done some wrong, and you certainly have done some wrong, right? And we can agree to that and understand that because we know it. We don't need to prove it through our words because we already see it. And when we identify the weakness of ourselves before others, that's when you win the battles. That's when you have victory over sin. That's when you have victory over pride. I wanted to point and end with this last scripture verse from St. Mark chapter 7, verse 20 through 23. St. Mark chapter 7, verse 20 through 23. And it reads as this: and he said, what comes out of a man, that defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile man. St. Mark chapter 7, verse 20 through 23. So look at the beginning and the end of the passage. In the beginning, Christ says, what comes out of a man, that defiles a man. At the end, it says, all these things come from within and defile man. So this is where we begin the battle against pride. It's not simply what is coming out of us that defiles us alone, but also that which is within us. You have to be able to recognize what is within you, because if you have no recognition of what is within you, you're not going to even be able to see what is coming out of you. Others can see what is coming out of you, but they cannot see what is within you. So this is where we begin the battle against pride, is, as I mentioned before, looking at the physical, looking at the psychological, and looking at the spiritual, and looking at the communal aspect. There's this aspect of looking within first so that we can see what is coming out. And what is coming out, sometimes we may not even recognize. And it may take someone else to identify that for us before we can even realize where it is that we have gone. So that's where I wanted to end this evening. And I hope this is just, again, the beginning of what many of you probably already know and have probably understand or probably have thought of or even struggled with. But I just wanted to highlight some of these points as a practical way as we begin through this study series. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording for today. And I just wanted to, again, thank each and every one of you for your presence this evening.